"What's happening?" yelled Major Werner Pluskat into the phone. Dazed and only half awake, he was still in his underwear. The racket of planes and gunfire had awakened him, and every instinct told him that this was more than a raid. 2 years of bitter experience on the Russian front had taught the major to rely heavily on his instincts. Lieutenant Colonel Ocker, his regimental commander, seemed annoyed at Pluskat's phone call. "My dear Pluskat," he said icily, "we don't know yet what's going on. We'll let you know when we find out." There was a sharp click as Ocker hung up. The reply didn't satisfy Pluskat. For the past 20 minutes planes had been droning through the flare-studded sky, bombing the coast to the east and the west. Pluskat's coastal area in the middle was uncomfortably quiet. From his headquarters at Etraham, 4 miles from the coast, he commanded 4 batteries of the German 352nd Division, 20 guns in all. They covered one half of Omaha Beach. Nervously, Pluskat decided to go over his regimental commander's head. He phoned division headquarters and spoke with the 352nd Division's intelligence officer, Major Block. "Probably just another bombing raid, Pluskat," Block told him. "It's not clear yet." Feeling a little foolish, Pluskat hung up. He wondered if he had been too impetuous. After all, there had been no alarm. In fact, Pluskat recalls, after weeks of on-again, off-again alerts, this was one of the few nights when his men had been ordered to stand down. Pluskat was wide awake now, too uneasy for sleep. He sat on the edge of his cot for some time. At his feet, Harris, his German shepherd, lay quietly. In the chateau, all was still, but off in the distance, Pluskat could still hear the droning of planes. Suddenly, the field telephone rang. Pluskat grabbed it. "Paratroopers are reported on the peninsula," said the calm voice of Colonel Ocker. "Alert your men and get down to the coast right away. This could be the invasion." Minutes later, Pluskat, Captain Lutz Wilkening, the commander of his 2nd Battery, and Lieutenant Fritz Thien, his gunnery officer, started out for their advance headquarters, an observation bunker built into the cliffs near the village of Steonorine. Harris went with them. It was crowded in the jeep like Volkswagen, and Pluskat recalls that in the few minutes it took them to reach the coast, nobody talked. He had one big worry. His batteries had only enough ammunition for 24 hours. A few days before, General Marks of the 84th Corps had inspected the guns, and Pluskat had raised the question. "If an invasion ever does come in your area," Marks had assured him, "you'll get more ammunition than you can fire." Passing through the outer perimeter of the coastal defense zone, the Volkswagen reached Steonorine. There, with Harris on a leash and followed by his men, Pluskat slowly climbed a narrow track back of the cliffs leading to the hidden headquarters. The path was clearly marked by several strands of barbed wire. It was the only entrance to the post, and there were minefields on either side. Almost at the top of the cliff, the major dropped into a slit trench, went down a flight of concrete steps, followed a twisting tunnel, and finally entered a large, single-roomed bunker manned by 3 men. Quickly, Pluskat positioned himself before the high-powered artillery glasses which stood on a pedestal opposite one of the bunker's 2 narrow apertures. The observation post couldn't have been better sited. It was more than 100 feet above Omaha Beach and almost directly in the center of what was soon to be the Normandy beachhead. On a clear day, from this vantage point, a spotter could see the whole bay of the Seine, from the tip of the Cherbourg Peninsula off to the left to Le Havre and beyond on the right. Even now, in the moonlight, Pluskat had a remarkable view. Slowly moving the glasses from left to right, he scanned the bay. There was some mist. Black clouds occasionally blanketed out the dazzling moonlight and threw dark shadows on the sea, but there was nothing unusual to be seen. There were no lights, no sound. Several times he traversed the bay with the glasses, but it was quite empty of ships. Finally, Pluskat stood back. "There's nothing out there," he said to Lieutenant Thien as he called regimental headquarters. But Pluskat was still uneasy. "I'm going to stay here," he told Ocker. "Maybe it's just a false alarm, but something still could happen." By now vague and contradictory reports were filtering into 7th Army command posts all over Normandy, and everywhere officers were trying to assess them. They had little to go on shadowy figures seen here. Shots fired there, a parachute hanging from a tree somewhere else. Clues to something, but what? Only 570 Allied airborne troops had landed. This was just enough to create the worst kind of confusion. Reports were fragmentary, inconclusive, and so scattered that even experienced soldiers were skeptical and plagued by doubts. How many men had landed 200? Were they bomber crews that had bailed out? Was this a series of French underground attacks? Nobody was sure, not even those, like General Reichert of the 711th Division, who had seen paratroopers face to face. Reichert thought that it was an airborne raid on his headquarters, and that was the report he passed on to his corps commander. Much later, the news reached 15th Army headquarters, where it was duly recorded in the war diary with the cryptic note, "No details given." There had been so many false alarms in the past that everyone was painfully cautious. Company commanders thought twice before passing reports on to battalion. They sent out patrols to check and recheck. Battalion commanders were even more careful before informing regimental officers. As to what actually transpired at the various headquarters in these first minutes of D-Day, there are as many accounts as there were participants. But one fact seems clear. On the basis of such spotty reports, nobody at this time was willing to raise the alarm, an alarm that later might be proved wrong. And so the minutes ticked by. On the Cherbourg Peninsula, 2 generals had already departed for the map exercise in Rennes. Now a third, Major General Wilhelm Falley of the 91st Air Landing Division, chose this time to set out. Despite the order issued from 7th Army headquarters forbidding commanding officers to leave before dawn, Falley did not see how he could make the Kriegspiel unless he departed earlier. His decision was to cost him his life. At 7th Army headquarters in Le Mans, the commanding officer, Colonel General Friedrich Dollmann, was asleep. Presumably because of the weather, he had actually cancelled a practice alert scheduled for this very night. Tired out, he had gone to bed early. His chief of staff, the very able and conscientious Major General Max Pemsel, was preparing for bed. In Saint-Lô, at the headquarters of the 84th Corps, the next level of command below Army headquarters, all was set for General Erich Marx's surprise birthday party. Major Friedrich Hayne, the Corps intelligence officer, had the wine ready. The plan was for Hayne, Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von Kriegern, the Chief of Staff, and several other senior officers to walk into the General's room as the clock in Saint-Lô Cathedral struck midnight. Everybody wondered how the stern-faced, one-legged Marx would react. He was considered one of the first generals in Normandy, but he was also an austere man not given to demonstrations of any kind. Still, the plans were set, and although everybody felt a little childish about the whole idea, the staff officers were determined to go through with the party. They were almost ready to enter the general's room, when suddenly they heard a nearby flak battery open up. Rushing outside, they were just in time to see an Allied bomber spiralling down in flames, and to hear the jubilant gun crew yelling, "We got it! We got it!" General Marx remained in his room. As the cathedral bells began chiming, the little group, with Major Hayne in the lead, carrying the Chablis and several glasses, marched into the general's room, perhaps a shade self-consciously, to do honour to their commander. There was a slight pause as Marx looked up and gazed at them mildly through his glasses. His artificial leg creaked, recalls Hayne, as he rose to greet us. With a friendly wave of the hand, he immediately put everybody at ease. The wine was opened, and standing in a little group around the 53-year-old general, his staff officers came to attention. Stiffly raising their glasses, they drank his health, blissfully unaware that 40 miles away, 4,200 British paratroopers were dropping on French soil. Across the moonlit fields of Normandy rolled the hoarse, haunting notes of an English hunting horn. The sound hung in the air, lonely, incongruous. Again and again the horn sounded. Scores of shadowy, helmeted figures, in green, brown and yellow camouflaged jump smocks festooned with equipment, struggled across fields, along ditches, by the sides of hedgerows, all heading in the direction of the call. Other horns took up the chorus. Suddenly a bugle began trumpeting, for hundreds of men of the British 6th Airborne Division. The strange cacophony came from the Ranville area. The calls were the assembly signals for 2 battalions of the 5th Parachute Brigade, and they had to move fast. One was to rush to the assistance of Major Howard's tiny glider-borne force holding the bridges. The other was to seize and hold Ranville at the eastern approaches to this vital crossing. Never before had paratroop commanders assembled men in this manner, but speed this night was essential. The 6th Airborne was racing against time. The first waves of American and British troops would land on Normandy's 5 invasion beaches between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m. The Red Devils had 5.5 hours to secure the initial foothold and anchor the left flank of the entire invasion area. The division had a variety of complex tasks, each one demanding almost minute-by-minute synchronization. The plan called for paratroopers to dominate the heights northeast of Caen, hold the bridges over the Orne and the Caen Canal, demolish 5 more on the Dives River, and thus block enemy forces, particularly panzers, from driving into the side of the invasion bridgehead. But the lightly armed paratroopers didn't have enough firepower to stop a concentrated armoured attack, so the success of the holding action depended on the speedy and safe arrival of anti-tank guns and special armour-piercing ammunition. Because of the weight and size of the guns, there was only one way of getting them safely into Normandy, by glider train. At 3:20 a.m. a fleet of 69 gliders was due to sweep down out of the Normandy skies, carrying men, vehicles, heavy equipment, and the precious guns. Their arrival posed a mammoth problem all by itself. The gliders were immense, each one larger than a DC-3. 4 of them, the Hamilcars, were so big that they could even carry light tanks. To get the 69 gliders in, the paratroopers had first to secure the chosen landing zones from enemy attack. Next, they had to create a huge landing field out of the obstacle-studded meadows. This meant clearing a forest of mined tree trunks and railroad ties in the dead of night and in just under 2.5 hours. The same field would be used for a second glider train due to land in the evening. There was one more job to be done. It was perhaps the most important of all the 6th Airborne's missions, the destruction of a massive coastal battery near Merville. Allied intelligence believed that this battery's 4 powerful guns could harass the assembling invasion fleet and massacre the troops landing on Sword Beach. The 6th had been ordered to destroy the guns by 5 a.m. To accomplish these tasks, 4,200 paratroopers of the 3rd and 5th Parachute Brigades had jumped into Normandy. They dropped over a huge area, victims of navigational errors, bucketing planes forced off course by flak fire, badly marked drop zones and gusty winds. Some were fortunate, but thousands fell anywhere from 5 to 35 miles from the drop zones. Of the 2 brigades, the 5th fared best. Most of its soldiers were dropped close to their objectives near Runville. Even so, it would take company commanders the better part of 2 hours to assemble even half their men. Scores of troopers, however, were already en route, guided in by the wavering notes of the horns. Private Raymond Batten of the 13th Battalion heard the horns, but although he was almost at the edge of his drop zone, he was momentarily unable to do anything about it. Batten had crashed through the thick, leafy roof of a small woods. He was hanging from a tree, slowly swaying back and forth in his harness, just 15 feet from the ground. It was very still in the woods, but Batten could hear prolonged bursts of machine gun fire, the droning of planes and the firing of flak batteries off in the distance. As he pulled out his knife, ready to cut himself down, Batten heard the abrupt stutter of a Schmeisser machine pistol nearby. A minute later, there was a rustling of underbrush, and somebody moved slowly toward him. Batten had lost his Sten gun in the drop, and he didn't have a pistol. Helplessly he hung there, not knowing whether it was a German or another paratrooper moving toward him. Whoever it was came and looked up at me, Batten recalls. All I could do was to keep perfectly still, and he, probably thinking I was dead as I hoped he would, went away. Batten got down from the tree as fast as he could and headed toward the rallying horns. But his ordeal was far from over. At the edge of the woods, he found the corpse of a young paratrooper whose parachute had failed to open. Next, as he moved along a road, a man rushed past him, shouting crazily, "They got my mate! They got my mate!" And finally, catching up with a group of paratroopers heading toward the assembly point, Batten found himself beside a man who seemed to be in a state of complete shock. He strode along, looking neither to his left or right, totally oblivious of the fact that the rifle which he gripped tightly in his right hand was bent almost double. In many places this night men like Batten were shocked almost immediately into the harsh realities of war. As he was struggling to get out of his harness, Lance Corporal Harold Tate of the 8th Battalion saw one of the Dakota transports hit by flak. The plane careened over his head like a searing comet and exploded with a tremendous noise about a mile away. Tate wondered if the stick of troopers it carried had already jumped. Private Percival Liggins of the Canadian 1st Battalion saw another flaming plane. It was at full power, with pieces falling off it, blazing from end to end, and seemed to be heading for him. He was so fascinated by the sight that he was unable to move. It swept overhead and crashed in a field behind him. He and others tried to get to the plane in an effort to rescue anybody still in it, but the ammo started to go and we couldn't get near it. To 20-year-old Private Colin Powell of the 12th Battalion, miles from his drop zone, the first sound of war was a moaning in the night. He knelt down beside a badly wounded trooper, an Irishman, who softly pleaded with Powell to "Finish me off, lad, please." Powell could not do it. He made the trooper as comfortable as he could and hurried off, promising to send back help. In these first few minutes, their own resourcefulness became the measure of survival for many men. One paratrooper, Lieutenant Richard Hilborn of the Canadian 1st Battalion remembers, crashed through the top of a greenhouse, shattering glass all over the place and making a hell of a lot of noise, but he was out and running before the glass had stopped falling. Another fell with pinpoint accuracy into a well. Hauling himself up hand over hand on his shroud lines, he set out for his assembly point as though nothing had happened. Everywhere men extricated themselves from extraordinary predicaments. Most of their situations would have been bad enough in daylight. At night, in hostile territory, they were compounded by fear and imagination. Such was the case with Private Godfrey Madison. He sat at the edge of a field, imprisoned by a barbed wire fence, unable to move. Both legs were twisted in the wire, and the weight of his equipment, 125 pounds, including 4 10-pound mortar shells, had driven him so far forward into the wire that he was almost completely enmeshed. Madison had been heading toward the rallying horns of the 5th when he missed his footing and crashed into the fence. "I started to panic a bit," he remembers, "and it was very dark and I felt sure someone would take a pot shot at me." For a few moments he did nothing but wait and listen. Then, satisfied that he had escaped notice, Madison began a slow and painful struggle to free himself. It seemed hours before he finally worked one arm free enough to get a pair of wire cutters from the back of his belt. In a few minutes he was out and heading in the direction of the horns again. At about that same time, Major Donald Wilkins of the Canadian 1st Battalion was crawling past what appeared to him to be a small factory building. Suddenly he saw a group of figures on the lawn. He instantly threw himself to the ground. The shadowy figures did not move. Wilkins stared hard at them, and after a minute got up cursing and went over to confirm his suspicions. They were stone garden statues. A sergeant of the same unit had a somewhat similar experience, except that the figures he saw were only too real. Private Henry Churchill, in a nearby ditch, saw the sergeant, who had landed in knee-deep water, shrug out of his harness and look about in desperation as 2 men approached. The sergeant waited, Churchill remembers, trying to decide whether they were British or Germans. The men came closer, and their voices were unmistakably German. The sergeant's Sten gun barked, and he brought them down with a single fast burst. The most sinister enemy in these opening minutes of D-Day was not man but nature. Rommel's anti-paratroop precautions had paid off well. The waters and swamps of the flooded Dives Valley were death traps. Many of the men of the 3rd Brigade came down in this area like so much confetti shaken haphazardly out of a bag. For these paratroopers, mishap followed tragic mishap. Some pilots, caught in heavy cloud, mistook the mouth of the Dives for that of the Orne, and let men out over a maze of marshes and swamps. One entire battalion of 700, whose drop was to be concentrated in an area roughly a mile square, was scattered, instead over 50 miles of countryside, most of it swampland. And this battalion, the highly trained 9th, had been given the toughest, most urgent job of the night, the assault on the Merville battery. It would take some of these men days to rejoin their unit. Many would never return at all. The number of troopers who died in the wastes of the Dives will never be known. Survivors say that the marshes were intersected by a maze of ditches about 7 feet deep, 4 feet wide and bottomed with sticky slime. A man alone, weighed down with guns, ammunition and heavy equipment, could not negotiate these ditches. Wet kit bags nearly doubled in weight, and men had to discard them in order to survive. Many men who somehow struggled through the marshes drowned in the river with dry land only a few yards away. Private Henry Humberstone of the 224th Parachute Field Ambulance narrowly missed such a death. Humberstone landed waist-deep in the marshes, with no idea of where he was. He had expected to come down in the orchard area west of Varaville. Instead, he had landed on the east side of the drop zone. Between him and Varaville were not only the marshes, but the Dives River itself. A low mist covered the area like a dirty white blanket, and all around Humberstone could hear the croaking of frogs. Then ahead came the unmistakable sound of rushing water. Humberstone stumbled on through the flooded fields and came upon the Dives. While he looked for some way to cross the river, he spotted two men on the opposite bank. They were members of the Canadian 1st Battalion. "How do I get across?" yelled Humberstone. "It's quite safe," one of them called back. The Canadian waded into the river, apparently to show him. "I was watching him 1 minute and the next minute he was gone," Humberstone remembers. "He didn't yell or scream or anything. He just drowned before either me or his buddy on the other bank could do anything." Captain John Gwinnett, the chaplain of the 9th Battalion, was completely lost. He too had landed in the marshes. He was all alone and the silence around him was unnerving. Gwinnett had to get out of the swamps. He was certain the Merville assault would be a bloody one, and he wanted to be with his men. "Fear," he had told them at the airfield just before takeoff, knocked at the door. Faith opened it, and there was nothing there. Gwinnett did not know it now, but it would be a full 17 hours before he found his way out of the swamps. At this moment, the 9th's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway, was in a towering rage. He had been dropped miles from the rendezvous point, and he knew that his battalion must have been thoroughly scattered. As Otway marched quickly through the night, small groups of his men appeared everywhere, confirming his worst suspicions. He wondered just how bad the drop had been. Had his special glider train been scattered too? Otway badly needed the glider-borne guns and other equipment if his plan of assault was to succeed, for Merville was no ordinary battery. Around it ranged a formidable series of defences in depth. To get to the heart of the battery, 4 heavy guns in massive concrete emplacements, the 9th would have to pass through minefields and over anti-tank ditches, penetrate a 15-foot thick hedge of barbed wire, cross more minefields and then fight through a maze of machine-gun-filled trenches. The Germans considered this deadly fortification with its garrison of 200 men almost impregnable. Otway didn't think it was, and his plan to destroy it was elaborate and incredibly detailed. He wanted to leave nothing to chance. 100 Lancaster bombers were to saturate the battery first with 4,000-pound bombs. The glider trains were to bring in jeeps, anti-tank guns, flamethrowers, Bangalore torpedoes, mine detectors, mortars, and even lightweight aluminum scaling ladders. After collecting this special equipment from the gliders, Otway's men were to set out for the battery in 11 teams to begin the assault. This called for dovetailed timing. Reconnaissance teams would lead off and scout the area. Taping parties would remove the mines and mark the approaches through the cleared areas. Breaching teams with the Bangalore torpedoes would destroy the barbed wire. Snipers, mortarmen and machine gunners were to take up positions to cover the main charge. Otway's plan had one final surprise. At the same time that his assault troops rushed the battery from the ground, 3 gliders filled with more troopers were to crash land on the top of the battery, in a combined massive rush on the defences from ground and air. Parts of the plan seemed suicidal, but the risks were worth taking, for the Merville guns could kill thousands of British troops as they touched down on Sword Beach. Even if everything went according to schedule in the next few hours, by the time Otway and his men assembled, moved out and reached the battery, they would have barely an hour to destroy the guns. He had been told plainly that if the 9th could not complete the task on time, naval gunfire would try to do it. That meant that Otway and his men had to be away from the battery, no matter what the outcome, by 5:30 a.m. At that time, if the signal of success had not come from Otway, the bombardment would begin. That was the strategy. But as Otway hurried anxiously toward the assembly point, the first part of the plan had already misfired. The air attack which had taken place at 12:30 had been a complete failure. Not one bomb had hit the battery, and the errors were multiplying. The gliders with the vital supplies had failed to arrive. In the centre of the Normandy beachhead, in the German observation bunker overlooking Omaha Beach, Major Werner Pluskat still watched. He saw the white tops of the waves, nothing more. His uneasiness had not lessened. If anything, Pluskat felt more certain than ever that something was happening. Soon after he reached the bunker, formation after formation of planes had thundered over the coast far off to the right. Pluskat thought there must have been hundreds. From the first moment he heard them, he had expected a sudden call from regiment confirming his suspicions that the invasion was in fact beginning. But the phone had remained silent. There had been nothing from Oka since the first call. Now Pluskat heard something else, the slowly swelling roar of a great number of planes off to his left. This time the sound was coming from behind him. The planes seemed to be approaching the Cherbourg Peninsula from the west. Pluskat was more bewildered than ever. Instinctively he looked out through his glasses once again. The bay was completely empty. There was nothing to be seen. In Stomer-Église the sound of bombing was very close. Alexandre Renaud, the mayor and town pharmacist, could feel the very ground shaking. It seemed to him that planes were attacking the batteries at Saint-Marcouf and Saint-Martin-de-Varreville, and both places were only a few miles away. He was quite worried about the town and its people. About all the habitants could do was take shelter in garden trenches or cellars, for they could not leave their homes because of the curfew. Renaud herded his wife, Simone, and their 3 children to the passageway leading off the living room. Its heavy timbers afforded good protection. It was about 1:10 a.m. when the family collected in the makeshift air raid shelter. Renaud remembers the time, because just then there was a persistent, urgent knocking at the street door. Renaud left his family in their living quarters and walked through his darkened pharmacist's shop, which fronted on the Place d'Église. Even before he reached the door, he could see what the trouble was. Through the windows of his shop, the square, with its edging of chestnut trees and its great Norman church, appeared brilliantly lit up. Monsieur Héron's villa across the square was on fire and blazing fiercely. Renaud got the door open. The town's fire chief, resplendent in his polished shoulder-length brass helmet, stood before him. "I think it was hit by a stray incendiary from one of the planes," the man said without any preamble, motioning toward the burning house. "The fire is spreading fast. Can you get the commandant to lift the curfew? We need as much help as we can get for the bucket brigade." The mayor ran to the nearby German headquarters. He quickly explained the situation to the sergeant on duty, who, on his own authority, gave permission. At the same time, the German called out the guard to watch the volunteers when they assembled. Then Renaud went to the parish house and told Father Louis Rouland. The curé sent his sexton to the church to toll the bell, while he, Renaud, and the others banged on doors, calling for the inhabitants to help. Above them the bell began to clang, booming out over the town. People started to appear, some in their nightwear, others half-dressed, and soon more than 100 men and women in 2 long lines were passing buckets of water from hand to hand. Surrounding them were about 30 German guards armed with rifles and schmeissers. In the midst of this confusion, Renaud remembers, Father Rouland took him aside. "I must talk to you something very important," the priest said. He led Renaud to the kitchen of the parish house. There Madame Angèle Levrault, the aged schoolmistress, awaited them. She was in a state of shock. "A man has landed in my pea-patch," she announced in a wavering voice. Renaud had almost more trouble than he could handle, but he tried to calm her. "Don't worry," he said. "Please go home and stay indoors." Then he raced back to the fire. The noise and confusion had intensified in his absence. The flames were higher now. Showers of sparks had spread to the outbuildings, and they were already starting to burn. To Renaud, the scene had a nightmarish quality. He stood almost rooted to the spot, seeing the flushed, excited faces of the firefighters, the overdressed, ponderous German guards with their rifles and machine guns. And above the square the bell still tolled, adding its persistent clanging to the din. It was then they all heard the droning of the planes. The sound came from the west, a steadily mounting roar, and with it the approaching racket of anti-aircraft fire as battery after battery across the peninsula picked up the formations. In the square of Saint-Mère-Église everybody looked up, transfixed, the burning house forgotten. Then the guns of the town began firing and the roaring was on top of them. The aircraft swept in, almost wing-tip to wing-tip, through a criss-crossing barrage of fire that hammered up from the ground. The plane's lights were on. They came in so low that people in the square instinctively ducked, and Renaud remembers that the airplanes cast great shadows on the ground, and red lights seemed to be glowing inside them. In wave after wave, the formations flew over. The first planes of the biggest airborne operation ever attempted 882 planes, carrying 13,000 men. These men of the US 101 and veteran 82nd Airborne Divisions were heading for 6 drop zones, all within a few miles of Sainte-Mère-Église. The troopers tumbled out of their planes, stick after stick, and as those destined for the zone outside the town drifted down, scores of them heard an incongruous sound over the clatter of battle, a church bell tolling in the night. For many, it was the last sound they ever heard. Caught by a heavy wind, a number of soldiers floated down toward the inferno of the Place de l'Églison, the guns of the German guards that a twist of fate had placed there. Lieutenant Charles Santasiero of the 101 and 506 Regiment was standing in the door of his plane as it passed over Sainte-Mère-Église. We were about 400 feet up, he remembers, and I could see fires burning and krauts running about. There seemed to be total confusion on the ground. All hell had broken loose. Flak and small arms fire was coming up, and those poor guys were caught right in the middle of it. Almost as soon as he left his plane, Private John Steele of the 82nd 505 Regiment saw that instead of landing in a lighted drop zone, he was heading for the center of a town that seemed to be on fire. Then he saw German soldiers and French civilians running frantically about. Most of them, it seemed to Steele, were looking up at him. The next moment he was hit by something that felt like the bite of a sharp knife. A bullet had smashed into his foot. Then Steele saw something that alarmed him even more. Swinging in his harness, unable to veer away from the town, he dangled helplessly as his chute carried him straight toward the church steeple at the edge of the square. Above Steele, Private First Class. Ernest Blanchard heard the church bell ringing and saw the maelstrom of fire coming up all around him. The next minute he watched horrified as a man floating down almost beside him exploded and completely disintegrated before my eyes, presumably a victim of the explosives he was carrying. Blanchard began desperately to swing on his risers, trying to veer away from the mob in the square below. But it was too late. He landed with a crash in one of the trees. Around him men were being machine-gunned to death. There were shouts, yells, screams, and moan sounds that Blanchard will never forget. Frantically, as the machine gunning came closer, Blanchard sawed at his harness. Then he dropped out of the trees and ran in panic, unaware that he had also sawed off the top of his thumb. It must have seemed to the Germans that Sainte-Mère-Église was being smothered by paratroop assault, and certainly the townspeople in the square thought that they were at the center of a major battle. Actually, very few Americans, perhaps 30, dropped into the town, and no more than 20 came down in and about the square, but they were enough to cause the German garrison of slightly less than 100 men to panic. Reinforcements rushed to the square, which seemed to be the focal point of the attack, and there some Germans, coming suddenly upon the bloody burning scene, seemed to Renaud to lose all control. About 15 yards from where the mayor stood in the square, a paratrooper plunged into a tree, and almost immediately, as he tried frantically to get out of his harness, he was spotted. As Renaud watched, about half a dozen Germans emptied the magazines of their submachine guns into him, and the boy hung there with his eyes open, as though looking down at his own bullet holes. Caught up in the slaughter all around them, the people in the square were now oblivious to the mighty airborne armada that was still droning ceaselessly overhead. Thousands of men were jumping for the 82nd drop zones northwest of the town, and the 101 zones east and slightly west, between Sainte-Mère-Église and the Utah invasion area. But every now and then, because the drop was so widely scattered, stray paratroopers from almost every regiment drifted into the holocaust of the little town. One or two of these men, loaded down with ammunition, grenades, and plastic explosives, actually fell into the burning house. There were brief screams, and then a fusillade of shots and explosions as the ammunition went up. In all this horror and confusion, one man tenaciously and precariously clung to life. Private Steele, his parachute draped over the steeple of the church, hung just under the eaves. He heard the shouts and the screams. He saw Germans and Americans firing at each other in the square and the streets, and, almost paralyzed by terror, He saw winking red flashes of machine guns as streams of stray bullets shot past and over him. Steele had tried to cut himself down, but his knife had somehow slipped out of his hand and dropped to the square below. Steele then decided that his only hope lay in playing dead. On the roof, only a few yards away from him, German machine gunners fired at everything in sight, but not at Steele. He hung so realistically dead in his harness that Lieutenant Willard Young of the 82nd, who passed by during the height of the fighting, still remembers the dead man hanging from the steeple. In all, Steele dangled there for more than 2 hours before being cut down and taken captive by the Germans. Shocked and in pain from his shattered foot, he has absolutely no recollection of the tolling of the bell, only a few feet from his head. The encounter at Sainte-Mère-Église was the prelude to the main American airborne assault, but in the scheme of things this initial and bloody skirmish asterisk was quite accidental. Although the town was one of the principal objectives of the 82nd Airborne, the real battle for Sainte-Mère-Église was still to come. Much had to be accomplished before then, for the 101 and 82nd Divisions, like the British, were racing the clock. To the Americans went the job of holding the right flank of the invasion area, just as their British counterparts were holding on the left. But much more was riding on the Americans' paratroopers. On them hung the fate of the whole Utah Beach operation. The main obstacle to the success of the Utah landing was a body of water known as the Douve River. As part of their anti-invasion measures, Rommel's engineers had taken brilliant advantage of the Douve and its principal tributary, the Merderet. These water barriers veining the lower part of the thumb-like Cherbourg landmass flow south and southeast through low-lying land, link up with the Carentan Canal at the base of the peninsula, and flowing almost parallel with the Vire River, empty into the English Channel. By manipulating the century-old La Barquette locks just a few miles above the town of Carentan, the Germans had inundated so much ground that the peninsula, marshy to begin with, was almost isolated from the remainder of Normandy. Thus, by holding the few roads, bridges and causeways through these wastes, the Germans could bottle up an invading force and eventually wipe it out. In the event of landings on the eastern coast, German forces attacking from the north and west could close the trap and drive the invaders back into the sea. That, at least, was the general strategy. But the Germans had no intention of allowing an invasion to get even that far. As a further defence measure, they had flooded more than 12 square miles of low-lying land behind the beaches on the eastern coast. Utah Beach lay almost in the centre of these man-made lakes. There was only one way that the men of the 4th Infantry Division could force their way inland, along 5 causeways running through the floods, and German guns controlled these. Holding the peninsula and these natural defence barriers were 3 German divisions, the 709 in the north and along the east coast, the 243rd defending the west coast, and the recently arrived 91st in the middle and spread about the base. Also, lying south of Carentan and within striking distance, was one of the finest and toughest German units in Normandy, Baron von der Heiter's 6th Parachute Regiment. Exclusive of naval units manning coastal batteries, Luftwaffe anti-aircraft contingents and a variety of personnel in the Cherbourg vicinity, the Germans could throw about 40,000 men almost immediately at an Allied attack of any sort. In this heavily defended area, Major General Maxwell D. Taylor's 101 Airborne Division and Major General Matthew B. Ridgway's 82nd had been given the enormous task of carving out and holding an airhead, an island of defence running from the Utah Beach area to a point far to the west across the base of the peninsula. They were to open up the way for the 4th Division and hold until relieved. In and about the peninsula, the American paratroopers were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. On the map, the airhead looked like the imprint of a short, broad left foot, with the small toes lying along the coast, the big toe at the La Barquette locks above Carentan and the heel back and beyond the Merderet and Douve marshes. It was roughly 12 miles long, 7 miles wide at the toes and 4 miles in width across the heel. It was a huge area to be held by 13,000 men, but it had to be taken in less than 5 hours. Taylor's men were to seize a 6-gun battery at Saint-Martin-de-Varreville, almost directly behind Utah, and race for 4 of the 5 causeways between there and the coastal hamlet of Poupeville. At the same time, crossings and bridges along the Douve and the Carentan Canal, particularly the La Barquette locks, had to be seized or destroyed. While the Screaming Eagles of the 101 secured these objectives, Ridgway's men were to hold the heel and the left side of the foot. They were to defend crossings over the Douve and the Mer de Ray, capture Saint-Mère-Église, and hold positions north of the town to prevent counterattacks from driving into the side of the bridgehead. The men of the airborne divisions had one other vital mission. The enemy had to be cleared off glider landing areas, for big glider trains were coming in to reinforce the Americans, just as they were the British, before dawn and again in the evening. The first flight, more than 100 gliders, was scheduled to arrive at 4 a.m. From the beginning, the Americans worked against staggering odds. Like the British, the US divisions were critically scattered. Only one regiment, the 505 of the 82nd, fell accurately. 60% of all equipment was lost, including most of the radios, mortars, and ammunition. Worse still, many of the men were lost too. They came down miles from any recognizable landmarks, confused and alone. The route of the planes was from west to east, and it took just 12 minutes to cross the peninsula. Jumping too late meant landing in the English Channel. Too early meant coming down somewhere between the west coast and the flooded areas. Some sticks were dropped so badly they actually landed closer to the western side of the peninsula than to their zones on the east. Hundreds of men, heavily weighted with equipment, fell into the treacherous swamps of the Mer de Ray and the Douve. Many drowned, some in less than 2 feet of water. Others, jumping too late, fell into the darkness over what they thought was Normandy and were lost in the channel. One entire stick of 101 paratroopers, some 15 or 18 soldiers, met such a death. In the next plane, Corporal Louis Milano fell on a sandy beach in front of a sign reading, "Achtung Minen." He had been the second man in his stick to jump. Off in the darkness, Milano could hear the quiet slapping sound of waves. He was lying in sand dunes surrounded by Rommel's anti-invasion obstacles, just a few yards above Utor Beach. As he lay there, trying to get his breath, he heard screams far off in the distance. Milano was not to find out until later that the screams were coming from the channel, where the last 11 men from his plane were at that moment drowning. Milano got off the beach fast, ignoring the possibility that it was mined. He climbed over a barbed wire fence and ran for a hedgerow. Someone else was already there. Milano didn't stop. He ran across a road and started to climb a stone wall. Just then he heard an agonized cry behind him. He whirled around. A flamethrower was hosing the hedgerow he had just passed, and outlined in the flame was the figure of a fellow paratrooper. Stunned, Milano crouched down by the wall. From the other side came the shouts of German voices and the firing of machine guns. Milano was caught in a heavily fortified area, with Germans on all sides of him. He prepared to fight for his life. There was one thing he had to do first. Milano, who was attached to a signal unit, pulled from his pocket a 2x2-inch communications log containing codes and passwords for 3 days. Carefully he tore up the log and page by page ate it all. On the other side of the airhead, men were floundering in the dark swamps. The Mer de Ray and the Douve were dotted with parachutes of all colours, and the little lights on equipment bundles gleamed eerily from out of the marshes and the water. Men plummeted down from the sky, barely missing one another as they splashed beneath the surface of the water. Some never appeared again. Others came up gasping, fighting for air and sawing desperately at chutes and equipment that could drag them under again. Like Chaplain John Gwinnett of the British 6th Airborne 50 miles away, the 101 chaplain, Captain Francis Sampson, landed in the wastes. The water was over his head. The priest was pinned by his equipment, and his parachute, caught by a strong wind, remained open above him. Frantically, he cut away the equipment hanging from him, including his mass kit. Then, with his parachute acting like a great sail, he was blown along for about 100 yards until he finally came to rest in shallow water. Exhausted, he lay there for about 20 minutes. At last, disregarding the machine gun and mortar fire that was beginning to come in, Father Sampson set out for the area where he had first gone under and doggedly began diving for his mass kit. He got it on the 5th try. It wasn't until much later that Father Sampson, thinking back about the experience, realized that the act of contrition he had so hurriedly said as he struggled in the water was actually the grace before meals. In countless small fields and pastures between the channel and the flooded areas, Americans came together in the night, drawn not by hunting horns but by the sound of a toy cricket. Their lives depended on a few cents' worth of tin fashioned in the shape of a child's snapper. One snap of the cricket had to be answered by a double snap, and for the 80-second alone a password. 2 snaps required one in reply. On these signals, men came out of hiding, from trees and ditches, around the sides of buildings, to greet one another. Major General Maxwell D. Taylor and a bare-headed, unidentified rifleman met at the corner of a hedgerow and warmly hugged each other. Some paratroopers found their units right away. Others saw strange faces in the night, and then the familiar, comforting sight of the tiny American flag stitched above the shoulder patch. As confused as things were, these men adapted quickly. The battle-tested troopers of the 82nd, with airborne assaults in Sicily and Salerno under their belts, knew what to expect. The 101, on its first combat jump, was fiercely determined not to be outdone by its more illustrious partner. All these men wasted as little time as possible, for they had no time to waste. The lucky ones who knew where they were assembled promptly and set out for their objectives. The lost ones joined with small groups made up of men from different companies, battalions and regiments. Troopers of the 82nd found themselves being led by 101 officers and vice versa. Men from both divisions fought side by side, often for objectives they had never heard of. Hundreds of men found themselves in small fields, surrounded on all sides by tall hedgerows. The fields were silent little worlds, isolated and scary. In them every shadow, every rustle, every breaking twig was the enemy. Private Dutch Schultz, in one such shadowy world, was unable to find his way out. He decided to try his cricket. On the very first click he got a response he hadn't bargained for. Machine gun fire. He threw himself to the ground, aimed his MI rifle in the direction of the machine gun position, and pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. He had forgotten to load it. The machine gun opened up again, and Dutch ran for cover in the nearest hedgerow. He made another careful reconnaissance of the field. Then he heard a twig crackle. Dutch felt a moment's panic, but he calmed down as his company commander, Lieutenant Jack Talladay, came through the hedgerow. "Is that you, Dutch?" Talladay called softly. Schultz hurried over to him. Together they left the field and joined a group that Talladay had already assembled. There were men from the 101 Division and from all 3 of the 82nd's regiments. For the first time since the jump, Dutch felt easy. He was no longer alone. Talladay moved down along the side of a hedgerow with his little group fanning out behind him. A short while later they heard, and then saw a group of men coming toward them. Talladay snapped his cricket and thought he heard an answering click. As our 2 groups approached each other, Talladay says, it was quite evident by the configuration of their steel helmets that they were Germans. And then there occurred one of those curious and rare happenings in war. Each group silently walked past the other in a kind of frozen shock, without firing a shot. As the distance between them grew, the darkness obliterated the figures as though they had never existed. All over Normandy this night paratroopers and German soldiers met unexpectedly. In these encounters, men's lives depended on their keeping their wits, and often on the fraction of a second it took to pull a trigger. 3 miles from Stamer-Église, Lieutenant John Wallace of the 82nd almost tripped over a German sentry who was in front of a machine-gun nest. For a terrible moment, each man stared at the other. Then the German reacted. He fired a shot at Wallace at point-blank range. The bullet struck the bolt mechanism of the lieutenant's rifle, which was directly in front of his stomach, nicked his hand and ricocheted off. Both men turned and fled. One man, Major Lawrence Leger of the 101, talked his way out of trouble. In a field between Sainte-Mère-Église and Utah Beach, Leger had collected a little group of men and was leading them toward the rendezvous point. Suddenly, Leger was challenged in German. He knew no German, but he was fluent in French. As the other men were some distance behind him and had not been seen, Leger, in the darkness of the field, posed as a young farmer and explained rapidly in French that he had been visiting his girl and was on his way home. He apologized for being out after curfew. As he talked, he was busily removing a strip of adhesive tape from a grenade, placed there to prevent the accidental release of the pin. Still talking, he yanked the pin, threw the grenade and hit the ground as it went off. He found he had killed 3 Germans. When I backtracked to pick up my brave little band, Leger recalls, I found they had scattered to the 4 winds. There were many ludicrous moments. In a dark orchard 1 mile from Saint-Mère-Église, Captain Lyle Putnam, one of the 82nd Battalion surgeons, found himself utterly alone. He gathered up all his medical equipment and began searching for a way out. Near one of the hedgerows he saw a figure approaching cautiously. Putnam froze in his tracks, leaned forward and loudly whispered the 82nd's password, "Flash." There was a moment of electric silence as Putnam waited for the countersign, "Thunder." Instead, to his amazement, Putnam recalls, the other man yelled, "Jesus Christ!" and turned and fled like a maniac. The doctor was so angry he forgot to be frightened. Half a mile away, his friend Captain George Wood, the 82nd's chaplain, was also alone and busily snapping his cricket. No one answered him. Then he jumped with fright as a voice behind him said, "For God's sake, Padre, stop that damn noise." Chastened, Chaplain Wood followed the paratrooper out of the field. By afternoon these two men would be in Madame Angèle Levrault's schoolhouse in Sainte-Mère-Église, fighting their own Wara war where uniforms made no difference. They would be tending the wounded and dying of both sides. By 2 a.m., although more than an hour would pass before all the paratroopers were on the ground, many small groups of determined men were closing in on their objectives. One group was actually attacking its target, an enemy stronghold of dugouts and machine gun and anti-tank gun positions in the village of Foucauville, just above Utah Beach. The position was of extreme importance, for it controlled all movement on the main road running behind the Utah Beach area road, which enemy tanks would have to use to reach the beachhead. Storming Foucauville called for a full company, but only 11 men under Captain Cleveland Fitzgerald had as yet arrived. So determined were Fitzgerald and his little group that they assaulted the position without waiting for more men. In this, the first recorded 101-unit battle of the D-Day airborne assault, Fitzgerald and his men got as far as the enemy command post. There was a short, bloody battle. Fitzgerald was shot in the lung by a sentry, but as he fell, he killed the German. At last, the outnumbered Americans had to pull back to the outskirts to await dawn and reinforcements. Unknown to them, 9 paratroopers had reached Foucauville some 40 minutes earlier. They had dropped into the strongpoint itself. Now, under the eyes of their captors, they were sitting in a dugout, oblivious of the battle, listening to a German practicing on his harmonica. These were crazy moments for everyone, particularly the generals. They were men without staffs, without communications, and without men to command. Major General Maxwell Taylor found himself with several officers, but only 2 or 3 enlisted men. Never, he told them, have so few been commanded by so many. Major General Matthew B. Ridgway was alone in a field, pistol in hand, counting himself lucky. As he was later to recall, at least if no friends were visible, neither were any foes. His assistant, Brigadier General James M. Jumpin' Jim Gavin, who at this time was in complete charge of the 82nd's parachute assault, was miles away in the swamps of the Murderay. Gavin and a number of paratroopers were trying to salvage equipment bundles from the marshes. In them were the radios, bazookas, mortars and ammunition Gavin so desperately needed. He knew that by dawn the heel of the airhead which his men were to hold would be under heavy attack. As he stood knee-deep in cold water alongside the troopers, other worries were crowding in on Gavin. He was not sure where he was, and he wondered what to do about the number of injured men who had found their way to his little group and were now lying along the edge of the swamp. Nearly an hour earlier, seeing red and green lights on the far edge of the water, Gavin had sent his aide, Lieutenant Hugo Olsen, to find out what they meant. He hoped they were the assembly lights of 2 of the 82nd's battalions. Olsen had not returned, and Gavin was getting anxious. One of his officers, Lieutenant John Devine, was out in the middle of the river, stark naked, diving for bundles. Whenever he came up, he stood out like a white statue, Gavin recalls, and I couldn't help thinking that he'd be a dead turkey if he was spotted by the Germans. Suddenly a lone figure came struggling out of the swamps. He was covered with mud and slime, and was wringing wet. It was Olsen coming to report that there was a railroad directly across from Gavin and his men, on a high embankment which snaked through the marshes. It was the first good news of the night. Gavin knew there was only one railroad in the district, the Cherbourg-Carentan track, which passed down the Merderet Valley. The general began to feel better. For the first time he knew where he was. In an apple orchard outside Sainte-Mère-Église, the man who was to hold the northern approaches to the town. The flank of the Utah invasion bridgehead was in pain and trying not to show it. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort of the 82nd had broken his ankle on the jump, but he had made up his mind to stay in the fighting no matter what happened. Bad luck had dogged Vandervoort. He had always taken his job seriously, sometimes too seriously. Unlike many another army officer, Vandervoort had never had a popular nickname, nor had he permitted himself the kind of close, easy relationship with his men that other officers enjoyed. Normandy was to change all that and more. It was to make him, as General Matthew B. Ridgway later recalled, one of the bravest, toughest battle. Vandervoort was to fight on his broken ankle for 40 days, side by side with the men whose approval he wanted most. Vandervoort's battalion surgeon, Captain Putnam, still fumbling from his encounter with the strange paratrooper in the hedgerow, came across the colonel and some of his troopers in the orchard. Putnam still vividly remembers his first sight of Vandervoort. He was seated with a raincape over him, reading a map by flashlight. He recognized me and, calling me close, quietly asked that I take a look at his ankle with as little demonstration as possible. His ankle was obviously broken. He insisted on replacing his jump boot, and we laced it tightly. Then, as Putnam watched, Vandervoort picked up his rifle and, using it as a crutch, took a step forward. He looked at the men around him. "Well," he said, "let's go." He moved out across the field. Like the British paratroopers to the east, the Americans in humour, in sorrow, in terror and in pain began the work they had come to Normandy to do. This, then, was the beginning. The first invaders of D-Day, almost 18,000 Americans, British and Canadians, were on the flanks of the Normandy battlefield. In between lay the 5 invasion beaches, and beyond the horizon, steadily approaching, the mighty 5,000-ship invasion fleet. The first of the vessels, the USS Bayfield, carrying the commander of the Navy's Force U, Rear Admiral D.P. Moon, was now within 12 miles of Utah Beach and preparing to drop anchor. Slowly the great invasion plan was beginning to unfold, and still the Germans remained blind. There were many reasons. The weather, their lack of reconnaissance. Only a few planes had been sent over the embarkation areas in the preceding weeks, and all had been shot down. Their stubborn belief that the invasion must come at the Pas-de-Calais, the confusion and overlapping of their own commands, and their failure to take the decoded underground messages seriously all played a part. Even their radar stations failed them this night. Those that had not been bombed had been confused by Allied planes flying along the coast, dropping bundles of window strips of tinfoil which snowed the screens. Only one station had made a report. It was only normal channel traffic. More than 2 hours had elapsed since the first paratroopers had landed. Only now were the German commanders in Normandy beginning to realize that something important might be happening. The first scattered reports were beginning to come in, and slowly, like a patient coming out of anesthetic, the Germans were awakening. Lieutenant Colonel William E. Ekman, commanding the 505, also says that one of the chaplains of the regiment, who dropped in Saint-Omer Église, was captured and executed within minutes.